For the majority of Nier Automata, you play as these fast-moving, hack-and-slash sexy robots who blitz across the map at 1,000,000 miles an hour, thrashing your enemies in the air, freedom of movement in every way. Traversal feels fantastic as you move through the greenery and ruins, not unlike where I'm standing now. Until... Brother, please start moving. About halfway through the game, you wake up in a new body. You're this rusty, clunky, industrial tin can of a robot who moves at a snail's pace. And you feel it. In fact, you're now one of the very robots you've been hacking and slashing for the last dozen hours, and now, in a desperate attempt to save your big brother, you seek out some oil to help them? Movement in this new form is slow, it's janky, and when you finally find some oil, you realize you need a bucket to carry it back. And then when you finally find that, if you thought you were moving slowly before, you move painstakingly slow now. You feel every labored step in a way you never have before, and every second your brother is slipping away. And yet, in this almost comical moment, the game goes out of its way to also, once you've finally carried that oil in your little bucket all the way back, to not warn you that the tiny bits of scrap metal and debris on the ground, which have never been an obstacle before, can trip you up and dump your oil all over the ground, forcing you to start over. So you do. You desperately go and grab your bucket and refill and re-navigate and waddle all your way back to your brother to dump it on him, who does not move. Because you knew, right from the start, that this wasn't going to help. Brother. And yet you tried. The game takes away your freedom of movement. It plays on your expectations of this environment you've been flipping and flying and skating through for hours to not only make you painfully aware of every step you take now, every decision you now have to make on an entirely different scale, but suddenly the death of a single one of these robots is set against the shadow of the hundreds you've already killed. Your mindless hack and slash is not what it was. This twist in framing is typical of Yoko Taro's work. Similar narrative shifts happen in the other Nier games, first facilitating the gamer instinct towards XP and leveling up and extreme acts of violence, and first and foremost, fun. Because it's fun to kill these robots, it just is. And then to use that against you. Nier Automata was one of those stories which just hit me out of nowhere. I had never heard of it, and my wife picked it out of a dollar bin at the warehouse and said, "Hey, try this," and I said, "I don't know if it's for me," but then I tried it, and I kept going, and suddenly it was 2 a.m., and I was bawling my eyes out as I watched the credits roll, and you only know the full meaning of that if you've played the game. I was a mess, and I walked away different. Everyone remembers, you must remember, the first time a story hits you out of nowhere like this. A blow so hard and fast you feel it deep in your soul, and it hurts just as much knowing that you will never be able to experience this story for the first time again. And it makes you feel alive, it makes you feel real. And it hurts, God, it hurts, this pain in your chest as this fictional world slips through your fingers. And it's the most beautiful feeling in the world. It's a high you keep searching for over and over, because you know there won't be another book or game or story that makes you feel like that for a long time. Until there is. Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Paterson was the first story I remember doing this for me. I must have been, 10, and if you don't know, it's about a boy and a girl who invent this fictional world they call Terabithia, and they escape the real world into it till it ends, and the real world comes swinging in. It should be no shock that it resonated with a kid like me, except the story isn't about that. It's about loss and maturing and trying to find magic in the mundane. Because at the end of the story, before Jesse and Leslie can ever save Terabithia, Leslie dies. The rope swing they use to access their fantastical little forest snaps, breaking her body on the rocks below. The mundane rushes up to meet the magical, and all too fast and hard. And when I finished Bridge to Terabithia, it was like a whole world had opened up around me, and I was the only one in it. Because a truly good story can also be a lonely island to be on. And it was a long time before I found that feeling again. Of course, I read a lot of good books, I played a lot of good games, I watched a lot of great films, but there are stories you love, and there are stories which change you. these fictional things which make us look at the real and see it differently, because these stories are real, in the ways that matter. They allow us to see and experience real things we never could before from new ways. They allow us to see what we're already experiencing anew. And it's a lonely experience again, not only because you inevitably discover it alone, but because the meaning you find in these stories is so wrapped up in the highly specific lens of your brain, of your hopes, your dreams, your issues, your problems, some of which you might not even feel like you can tell anyone else about. That even me, standing here telling you about Bridge to Terabithia, is just me shouting across the water. I wish I could fully communicate to you what Terabithia or Flowers for Algernon or the Paper Menagerie or Nier Automata have meant for me, but I can't. Not fully. We don't just want to share these stories with others, we want to share our experience with it, but there is no one else who will experience a story quite like you do. You've probably heard of Plato's cave allegory before, that in life, a lot of the time, we are only seeing the shadows on the wall of something else, the shape of it and how it moves, but not the full meaning, not the real reality of it. And in a way, it's a lot like that as much as I tell you about what these stories mean to me, as much as you tell others what your stories mean to you, we are just casting shadows on a wall. That's not actually what Plato's cave allegory is about, but I felt it fit. I did find that feeling again, though. I found it with Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, which you might know better as the film Arrival. The short story is a little different to the film. It's far less dramatic, but it's still about a linguist learning to communicate with aliens. But it's really about parenthood and love and how we imagine ourselves and family now and in the past and in the future. It's about our sense of self and what that means, and I was struggling with that at the time. When I first read it, I was struck with how thoughtful and reflective and grounded it was, even with these big ideas it was dealing with. There are only a handful of other stories which affected me as deeply as this, like Margaret Atwood's The Testaments, which for someone who was raised very religious was a deeply challenging book. It made me feel heard, but only by driving a dagger into my chest at the same time, perfectly capturing how faith is not some thing that we pick up off the ground and we can just let go of. It's an organ. It's something that we grow and is a part of us, and losing it is like a live dissection. Or there's the Telos Principle, or What Remains of Edith Finch, or Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which asked how much of me is me versus what the world decided I should be. Or Terry Pratchett's Hogfather, which has probably my favorite scene ever written. Stories are, I think, one of the most important ways we speak to each other, that we survive into the future. But they're also an incredibly important lens through which we understand ourselves. Stories we just make up, they're just words, and yet simply in the act of reading them and telling them and listening to them and playing them, they can change us. They become part of who we are. Stories are so fundamental to who we are as a species that we tell stories about the power of stories. Cornelia Funk's Inkheart says this loud and clear and very literally, where the very act of telling a story magically brings something to life. But more than that, it's about how we can't control the stories we tell sometimes, that they take on lives of their own as new people read them. It's about how pieces of us can survive beyond us through stories. Even one of my favorite stories, What Remains of Edith Finch, is fundamentally about a person being changed by stories they encounter, stories of their family, of their ancestors. They're usually presented as fiction, but they're truly about deeply real things, about obsession and dependency and hierarchy and superstition, which rotted their family from the inside out, such that in the end, like you as the player, they cannot walk away from this story unchanged. The entire premise of the game is about being connected to others, quite literally stepping into their shoes and their story. There's not a lot else to do in the game. All we can do is feel and be changed. But if stories are this powerful, if they are this important, this fundamental to who we are, then it's also sad when we forget them. There's some value in remembering. There are some stories which we should never forget, and we tell stories about that too. And I want to share one with you, one called The Funeralists, otherwise known as Hate in 5 Parts. Imagine for a moment a tooth fairy, but for stories. Imagine them crouched in a crumbling library, thousands of texts which will slowly be lost to time, and this little fairy has a job. That when the story is forgotten or lost for the last time, they come to it, they hold a candlelight vigil, and they lay it to rest.
We lit a candle for every burned book, every scroll ground down by the sands of time, every love letter torn apart. They had someone to harvest their souls, another their sins, even one to mark the loss of children's teeth. Don't be so surprised we remembered the books. Aren't they more important than teeth?
This fairy is one of many, and they call themselves the Funeralists. The story starts out with one of them on their first assignment, with the loss of the Library of Ashurbanipal, and we follow them all the way through to the end of the universe, through the rise and fall of humanity and all of their stories. She starts out admiring humanity, struck with awe and wonder at these creatures who can conjure meaning out of words, out of nothing, who can see meaning in the stars and the earth that she just can't. She watches a boy change just in the act of reading one of these tablets, knowing full well that this will be the last time anyone ever does so. And then she lays it to rest, reading the story out one final time, trying to do it justice.
They deserved that pastoral care one more time. Some texts wanted to be whispered, as if spoken to a lover. Others shouted like a proclamation or call to arms, and more still to be spoken calmly and clearly, wishing only for the reader or listener to understand them. They each had their own language, different rights and needs, but one never quite understands what that means until faced with the task.
Because there is no single, correct, perfect way to read a story. Every story is an island and it speaks to us differently. We bring different things to it. The Bridge to Terabithia I read will not be the same Bridge to Terabithia you read. And so in this way, stories live. They evolve as new people read them, as they're retold and reinterpreted. They sprout new limbs of meaning and context. And the funeralist gets caught up in the myriad of interpretations we give our stories, trying to figure out the perfect one to memorialize it before blowing out her candle, her first job finished. The Funeralist is about those stories which change us, but they're also about how we lose those stories. And the first way is the simplest. We forget. Individually and collectively. Eventually, the Library of Ashurbanipal would be forgotten. It'd be buried under the earth, and people would build over it and around it, and they'd wonder, looking at this old relic of another time, what was that? And even when it's discovered once more, most of what was in there will have been forgotten, lost to time and history. But the scene of wonder and awe at humanity is immediately juxtaposed with a much darker reality. Because if our words are as powerful as this, then they are also dangerous in the eyes of some. They become weapons, they become a contagion which must be burned away, and the story moves 2,500 years into the future to the Nazi book burnings, where thousands of stories were destroyed because they had the power to change us, to change society, because they challenged a different national narrative, another fiction in itself. And our little funeralist, who has done their job for thousands of years now, is left trying to reconcile the awe and wonder of that library, how humanity lovingly carved those thousands of tablets, how they weaved the tapestries on those walls, with this, with choking on the ash of blazing memory. The funeralist, watching thousands of books burn, says,
Have you ever watched an animal die? Not of old age and in their sleep, not surrounded by loved ones, but in the wild with a broken, unhealed ankle after stumbling into a ditch, their leg trapped under a fallen tree, or starving to death and terrified by a fate they do not understand. They cannot move, they cannot eat, and they do not know why. If you move them, it causes them even more pain, and then what? You cannot fix their broken body. And their broken body means they cannot fend for themselves. Prolonging their suffering seems cruel, but taking life is beyond you and not your decision to make, even though the animal cannot make that decision either. Instead of standing over them, you kneel beside them, as if coming down to their level might bring them some comfort. You imagine every twitch of their pain as your own. You take it into yourself and incorporate it into your being, and it wrenches at every lever of feeling till you cry, and you want to cry. You want to feel the vicarious pain because it is the only metric of empathy you can offer.
Ironically, we make a point to remember the burned books if we can. But this is another way we lose stories. We try to force them to be forgotten. We ban them, we burn them, we kill them in their cradles, because they're obscene or inappropriate or any number of other euphemisms people might use these days. And even if these stories eventually survive to another time for other people, they were lost for others who deserve to hear them. And it's still happening, including books like The Handmaid's Tale, a story I have increasingly come to adore. The Handmaid's Tale 2 being a story which recognizes the simple power of words, Offred being given the opportunity to play Scrabble in a dystopia where women are not even allowed to read. But as the funeralist watches these stories die, as she watches thousands of them go up in flames, she loses her childish admiration for humanity, even coming to hate us for a small eternity. Because from there, she watches empires rise and fall. She watches humanity spread out into the stars, colonize new planets. She sees the beauty and horror of how we tell and let our stories go. She learns how we use words to obscure and elevate our meaning. It's not a school, it's critical military infrastructure. A lesson you might have learned from Orwell's 1984. Of course, you'll know that the most fascinating part of 1984 isn't in the main body of the text. It's in the appendix essay at the end, The Principles of Newspeak. It's pseudoscientific, but it too speaks to the power of storytelling, of language itself, how we use it to shape our world, our frame of reference, because that is where their power lies. They make the difficult palatable, the complex relatable, the profound obvious, and they can also make the wrong appear right. Ignorance is strength, I suppose. But our funeralist marches on. She does her duty, she loves these stories, she lays them to rest, and she wisens up. She learns how and why we tell stories, until one day Earth is just a bunch of ruins like the ones I'm standing in right now. Until she's called out to some distant, forgotten moon, where the last humans, if they could be called that anymore, having evolved and adapted themselves, are living out their last days in a cave, drawing stories on stone and metal in the walls, not unlike the library she first encountered. And she watches this final chapter play out. She sees them fade, one by one, until the last of them, a mother who has watched all of her children die before her, dies too. And the funeralist is tasked with laying their stories they scrawled on the walls to rest. And she finds this a sad thing. For all she hated humanity all these years, with them died this incredible ability to tell stories, to find meaning everywhere we look. She does not love and admire humanity as she once did, but she does respect them. And she says,
"A part of a person dies with every page, but few had so much of a person as that one."
Because it's not just that stories like Bridge to Terabithia are transformative for us, but that our stories are some of the only things which will survive beyond us. The ones we write, the ones we share, the ones we change, how they're told through us. They're a lineage we pass down and inherit, that we read to our children, that we reinterpret every generation. Stories carry pieces of people with them. There is the sense of not 1,000 stories by 1,000 authors, but a single story, and each of us have our exits and our entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Which is why, arguably the most important part of this story, like Orwell's, is not in the main body of text. It's in the annotations. Throughout the story, there are footnotes from an unknown scholar. They comment on the poetic structure, the meaning, whether something is literal or metaphorical, turning the funeralists into a story, a document within its own world. And as you read these annotations, you realize this is a story which has survived the collapse of this universe into the next. And these are people examining the only surviving remnants of humanity, a story. The Funeralists is a love letter to these stories which change us, the ones which hit at something so deep in our core we may not even know what it is, that push us to see the world differently, more honestly, more clearly, that we see it with awe and wonder and horror and dread, and we cannot walk away from it the same person. And I wrote it as part of my short story collection, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity. This one actually featuring the end of humanity. And judging by the cover, this backdrop is frankly gorgeous and perfect, standing in the ruins of human civilization. The Funeralists, or Hate in 5 Parts, is one of my favorite stories in this book. Many of them have been previously published in magazines online and so on, but this one is only found in this book. I love stories which take place over thousands or even millions of years, and I wanted to take it a step further, a story so powerful it transcends this universe into the next. I want to say a massive thank you to the thousands of people who have already bought and read and especially reviewed the book. But I do think that currently, oh my gosh, there's an owl. Sorry, I've never seen an owl before. And if you're one of the millions who prefer audiobooks because it's easier that way for you, you listen in the car, etc., then guess what? The audiobook is out now as well. Stunningly voiced, some of them done by Murphy Napier, who you heard in this video. But I do think right now it's way too expensive. It came out way pricier than I wanted it to be, especially if you want a beautiful physical copy like this. And so I'm doing something about it. See, this book isn't just full of stories, it's also full of amazing art by incredible artists, some of whom are in this community. And when you publish a book on Amazon in color, it assumes that every single page needs to be in full color and that you require the highest quality paper, and that skyrocketed the price. Way higher than I ever wanted. It wasn't because I was getting like a massive cut of that. I want it to be more accessible than it was. So I've put up a new version of A Catalogue for the End of Humanity, which is literally just half price. Forever. $15 off like that. And that's because you get all of the stories, all the same, literally the same book, except the art is in black and white, meaning I can use a slightly cheaper printer and paper. The cover is of course still in color. And the great thing is all the pieces absolutely work in black and white. I actually saw many of them in black and white before color was added. And of course, if you still want the colored version, that's available as well. I want these stories to be more accessible, and this is me doing something about that, because ultimately me being able to share with you is the most important thing for me. And I don't want price to be as much of a barrier, which is why it's awesome that a few of the stories can actually be read completely for free at the links down in the description in the magazines that they were originally published in. I'm also just generally slashing the price overall, though not sure for how long, so now is the time to grab it. Audiobook, you got it. Ebook, you got it. Paperback, you got it. Hardback, you got it. All at my link tree down below. I absolutely love how all of this has come together, and I would love to share the whole of the Funeralist story with you. If you like the sound of it today, you will love the rest. The Funeralist was one of those stories which came to me just out of nowhere from a single visceral image. A tooth fairy for books, crouched in a crumbling library, laying stories to rest. And if you did not know, On Writing and Worldbuilding Volume 3 is finally out as an audiobook too. So I make a bunch of educational content here about writing and worldbuilding, and I pack all of that stuff into these books with a ton of exclusive content, extra analysis, and depth I could never fit on YouTube. And that's especially the case with Volume 3, which talks about writing dialogue and subtext and plot armor and anti-heroes and so much more. Every single book is completely different. I know a lot of people who read these books like to do so via audiobook, so I wanted that to be available as well. And they're all beautifully voiced, beautifully put together. It is getting towards the end of the year, and if you're looking for a Christmas gift for yourself or someone else who reads or writes, then all of these books are perfect for you or them. Of course, you can also get physical copies as well. Or if you want to be really special, you can just get all of them. Up to you. It's been a pleasure to share with you, and I would love for you to tell me down below, what are the stories that changed you? The ones which you didn't just love, that you didn't just enjoy, but have stayed with you in like a fundamentally, existentially relevant part of who you are. Tell me down below and why. See if you can shout across the water. This has been great. Pick it all up at the links down below. Tell me what you think. It's a real privilege that I get to do this, an amazing blessing. I love that I get to do this. It is just incredible, and that you guys allow me to. This book is only possible because of you guys. Also, how cool is this place, right? Yeah. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.